Nurses and doctors of Reddit, what is your "they never taught this in school" moment? A patient being treated for HIV purposefully tried exposing staff members to his fluids. That was a sobering experience. What the duck? Do you know the backstory behind this or the aftermath? It's actually fairly common. Sadly, cops and emergency responders have to deal with it too. There's entire protocols for it. Mental illness and desperation. Man. I think it gives people who do this a sense of control when they're spinning out. How to put a fake eye back in. A patient came in from a not so nice nursing home with a multitude of problems. One of which was a disgusting, draining fake eye that had to be removed for treatment. Upon discharge, we had to put it back in. Simple enough, we thought. But we had no idea how and struggled to figure it out. I suppose that is why the nursing home staff never took it out to clean it. This was decades ago. Fake eye technology is probably much better today. This one was fun. Patient in ER gets a standard urine drug screen. Positive for ethanol, alcohol. Patient insists he does not drink alcohol. Test is repeated. Positive. Patient is very upset. He does not drink alcohol. Blood test is drawn. It's negative. We checked everything we could think of. Did we have the right urine? The right blood? It should be impossible to test positive on urine and negative on blood. Meanwhile, I finish his regular urinalysis. High white blood cell count. And really high glucose. Elevated white cells means you need to look at it under the microscope because they probably have an infection. It's loaded with yeast. The man was diabetic, obviously, and had high glucose, sugar, in his urine. Along with a yeast infection of the bladder. The yeast was fermenting the glucose to ethanol within his bladder. He was the man who peed beer. When my mum was fresh out of nursing school in the 80s, she got a job at a hospital that had a high concentration of geriatric patients. One particularly frail man took out his dentures before sleeping, then passed away in the night during her shift. His cheeks were so alarmingly sunken in. My mum and another nurse tried to put them back in so as not to horrify the family. However, rigor mortis had already started to set in. She said nursing school definitely didn't prep her for that nightmare. Student nurse here. How to hide looks of shock when something very surprising or awkward occurs. I remember one time a doctor grabbed me when I was in the hall to hold something for him while he was putting a patient's prolapsed rectum back in. Awkward. When I was a med student, we had a patient with rectal prolapse and the charge nurse said only a doctor was allowed to push it back in. Something about this being a procedure with risk of perforation. Sure. Anyways. Cue the intern, resident, and myself googling how to push a prolapsed rectum in. My job that day was to find sugar packets because apparently if you can't just push it in, you sprinkle it with sugar and try again. Not something they taught us during the preclinical years, and obviously the intern and resident hadn't learned it in med school either. Nearing completion of an air contrast barium enema on an extremely elderly patient. Out of nowhere she starts saying "Call Rochester Funeral Home. I'm dead, call Rochester Funeral Home, I'm dead." She repeated it no less than 10 times. When I was a student I accidentally degloved a patient from the elbow down. They were incredibly sick. Probably already brain dead. And had one of the worst case of 10 toxic epidermal necrolysis I've ever seen. Anyway, I'm in there holding this lady's inside out arm skin like an idiot. With the family standing in the corner horrified. And I just froze. My first thought was to kind of slide it back on. But thankfully one of the senior nurses rescued me and snipped that sheet off. The first time I had to tell someone their loved one didn't make it. No one really tells you how to break bad news to someone. How shitty and impotent you'll feel doing it. The fact that you won't be able to answer their panicked questions. What it's like to realize that there's nothing you can say to family members that will truly bring comfort. How shocked or even angry you'll be when some people don't really care about mom going downhill. How ashamed you might feel when you look back and realize that you're becoming numb to it all after a while. Yeah. You probably had to click through some presentation on the 5 stages of grief at some point and maybe a generic lecture on what not to say. But until you've stumbled through it a few times, you're winging it. And probably poorly. Nurse here. A very panicked nursing assistant came running to the desk one day saying, "You have to come see this." I don't know what this is. The NA brought me into a patient's room where she was giving a bath and points to an area on the patient's buttocks. "What is that?" I lean in for a closer inspection. When the patient starts to turn back around and says, "Is that my eye?" Sure enough, I didn't receive a report that my patient had a prosthetic eye which at some point came out of the socket and became suction cupped to her buttock. I left the room and had never laughed so hard in my life. From former boss, how someone looks at you when he tests positive for HIV after his wife died of AIDS. Because you were her doctor and you treated her for years. You were also his doctor. You knew she hadn't told him. And you knew that she was still having unprotected sex with him. Wow. So many things. I think one important thing that was never taught is how to deal with a patient dying for the first time. I couldn't stop picturing his last breaths. The yelling of his family. All of it played through over and over. Hospice is tough. But it still is one of my favorite jobs I've ever done. On behalf of my husband, no one tells you how many low-income women will go to the ER. Complain of abdominal pain. Go through an exam and have different tests ordered because they can't afford a home pregnancy test. EMT here. Sorry to intrude. They teach you how to handle death. They tell you, you're going to have dead patients. You're going to see the ugly side of death that doctors and nurses don't have to see. Because when they get the patient, most of the ugly is handled by you. So we need thick skin. But when you have to hold the hand of a kid less than 10 years old who says I don't want to die and next watch him slide into an waking up sleep. It's ducking life changing. Duck me. I didn't want to cry tonight. Enough Reddit for today. For my GF. Walking into a patient's house, home health, and almost being knocked unconscious by the smell of cat piss. The lady housed 25 feral cats but didn't let them outside because she was afraid the coyotes would eat them. Walked into a trailer house connected to a camper only to see the floor start moving. Realized it was cockroaches. Not the actual floor. They never really tell you how to cope with being berated by family members, patients, and even co-workers. Part of being a nurse means that you realize you are dealing with people at their most vulnerable. And you know this in the back of your head. But being an emotional, and sometimes physical, punching back for days at a time requires a certain mental toughness that you can never really prepare for. I heard this story from a SLP. Always keep a clear exit. She was working with a stroke survivor. Set her at the workspace. And walked around to the back of the table with her back against the wall. And facing the door. Suddenly the little lady says, "I know who you are. You're the lady who has been sleeping with my husband." Suddenly this lady has lunged across the table and is legitimately trying to heal the SLP. Luckily lots of other people came when she screamed code blue. She couldn't think of anything else at the moment. I was never taught about sundown syndrome until I was working with the elderly in a hospital setting as a student nurse. I had the sweetest elderly patient in my care until about 4 PM that day. He suddenly became possessed. He started screaming and hallucinating and was not the man I had been providing care for earlier. I was so befuddled when the nurse I was shadowing told me he had sundowners and explained it to me. RN here, for me. The most surprising thing has been seeing firsthand how peaceful it is for a patient to be able to choose when and how they will die. I was present for the first medical assisted suicide on my unit. The patient had his loved ones surrounding him and we all watched as he said goodbye and shortly after took his last breath. In my area of nursing, patients get better and go home. I always viewed my work as a means to make people better. It has taken me a while to process his decision. It was beautiful and peaceful and really made me look at nursing in a different way. I care for people to help them live. But for this man I was able to support him through death. book world and real life nurse world is completely different. I'll play along. They never teach you that your psychotic dementia patients will try to hit you. They don't teach you how to react, or don't, to a patient or family member or physician yelling at you. Patients having sex and or shooting up in the bathrooms. People coming in OD'd and then bouncing out the door as soon as they are conscious to come in OD'd again a day or two later, then repeating the cycle every week or two but somehow never dying. Patients who fake symptoms to get admitted for attention or to get a day off work or get hopped up on goofballs or whatever thing they are after. Delirious old ladies telling me to get out of their living room or they will shoot me. Any kind of self-harm. Patients coming in next to dead because they've been neglected in the prison system. They never teach nurses how to manage expressions in unexpected or poor situations. I personally have no trouble hiding everything. But watching people around me and the people, patients, themselves tend to ask me what's wrong with that nurse doctor. Me being able to keep such a straight relaxed face and expression helps everyone around normally. Being able to explain something bad without a panicked expression is an invaluable skill. Which can definitely be taught. Though nothing can prepare you for some situations. I can say I can't remain relaxed when I see a high risk person self-remove a trash tube. Obligatory, not my story but my grandmother's. My grandmother was a school nurse at an elementary school. They were letting the kids out for the day and all of the kids were waiting outside for the day. One little boy's mom came to pick him up. As she was walking up to the building, she began to have a heart attack. My grandmother began CPR, sent someone to get the defibrillator, and told another teacher to call 911 as you were supposed to do. She passed before 911 arrived. I don't think twice her time in medical school could have prepared her for that. My mother was a nurse who cared for elderly patients in a very rural part of England. Here's a few her favorite stories. One was a lady who decided to help clean the windows. She used the food from her dinner as soap and napkins. There was a fun mess to clean up. Another was 3 gentlemen who spent the night calling out for their wives. One was named Edie. One was named Emma. The other was named Elspeth. She said that was one of the longest shifts ever. Finally, she said most of the elderly men were completely clueless when it came to ordering their dinners. They would always say something along the lines of "that's my wife's job." She used to just order them the basic meat and 2 veg option and rarely got complaints. Whatever your granddad would like usually was the safest bet. My grandfather was a farmer. As a sonographer, I have to keep a poker face a lot of times when I am seeing something very alarming or sad on the screen. Luckily, most people have no idea what I am looking at, so that's a plus. I'm not allowed to give any results to patients. Doctors deliver the bad news, so I have to stay neutral. It's really hard. When your patient has a sheet the size and shape of a football stuck in their butt, and you have to use your finger to delicately scoop it out. When the doctor comes along and tells your patient they are dying of cancer, then walks away and leaves you to pick up the pieces. When your patient is 90 years old, has dementia, diabetes, cancer and comes to hospital with pneumonia. They are 30 kilograms soaking wet. Nothing but a bag of bones who doesn't recognize themselves in the mirror. Yet their family insists they are for CPR. Had a 60-something-year-old female patient show up for a same-day appointment to establish care from out of state. No medical records. Denies any major medical history or medications. Never smoked. Drank. Or did drugs. Midway through the exam she starts telling me that she is seeing evil lines all over her house. States she is unable to cross these lines and thus unable to access parts of her house, for example, her bathroom. Hears voices coming through the walls. Feels shadows at night are demons. Thinks the neighbors are hexing her all the time. Starts talking about the occult and Freemasons ruling the world. Suddenly stops mid-sentence. Stares at me without blinking and wants to know if I could perform an exorcism. Oh, sorry. Missed that section in medical school. Sexually harassed by an elderly patient. The guy is 80 and frail. Was I grossed out? Yes. Was I threatened? No. But they don't teach us how to respond to impotent harassment from hospitalized patients. Do I get a new doctor for him? Should I put up with it? I treat rude abusive assholes every day. Why would this be any different? Still trying to figure out what I should do. Vet tech in the past, there was this big bulldog whom we sedated to remove an oral mass. The dog was intubated and the cuff at the end of the tube was fully inflated. That said, the dog managed to somehow swallow part of the mass and started choking on it. Right away I took all 120 pounds of him and turned him upside down, shaking him all over the operating table, trying to make him regurgitate the mass. Eventually I succeeded but had a back pain for the rest of the day. Lesson learned. Gotta work on my core. Had a patient with horrendous teeth, meth user. Couple of teeth fell out during intubation, so they sent him up with them in a denture cup. That was a real awkward conversation when he woke up. Anytime there's something up the butt. That time 100-year-old grandma broke her hip falling out of bed, but not her bed. On a more serious note, the "your loved one is dead" phone calls. This is usually done by the doctors, as I feel it should be. But sometimes nurses do it. As a nurse's aide we are just supposed to say "I'll get the nurse for you" when you get a real stumper. But when a dying patient or their family member cries to you they don't want to die, you can't get someone else to help them. You have to find the exact words to find in the middle of serving dinner and 5 call bells ringing off your hip. Probably the hardest situation in palliative work. What to do if a gang member comes into your ward and shoots your patient who is a rival gang member? That was a nightmare. 4 shots at point blank range and even then one of the bullets hit the overbed table instead. It freaked me out that you could still hear the bullet rattling around inside it whenever you moved it. I quit nursing soon after and went into it instead. One of my co-workers' patients was altered mentally and got physically abusive frequently. Like whenever the call bell went off everyone went running. Well, the alarm rang and I ran into the room and tried to get in between my co-worker and the patient who was hitting her repeatedly. When I approached he reached into his diaper and slammed a handful of poop onto my head and face. You don't learn how to deal with mental warfare in nursing school. Paramedic here. They don't give you a class on telling families bad news such as in the death of a loved one. I found over the years if you come out and say so and so is dead literally using the word dead people understand it better. It's brutally honest and not beating around the bush. I don't use passed on or in a better place. I'm not a religious person or even remotely spiritual so I don't say religious crap. It's not place to do that, I just give them the facts. As a student nurse I observed a cesarean DT preeclampsia. Lady is awake with epidural in place and a screen in front of her. All went well. Nothing dramatic there. Uterus sewn back up and I was starting to relax and look around when the surgeon asked the med student at the foot of the bed to step aside. He then reached in and pumped the uterus twice and hard, forcing the remaining after products out her vag fast. The wall wasn't that far from the foot of the bed and that student had definitely been in the line of fire. The PT didn't notice and the husband didn't seem to. The med student and I looked at each other. She just said, "I guess that's logical enough." Dunno how standard that is. Haven't been back to but I sure wasn't ready for it.